so clear I could almost see the shapes of the trees. Ahead of me was the runway itself, a black ribbon of tarmac, flanked by twin rows of bright burning lights. Far away to my right, the airfield tower stood up like a single glowing candle amid the hangars where the muffled aircraft men were even now closing down the station for the night. Inside the control tower, I knew all was warmth and merriment, the staff waiting only for my departure to close down also, jump into the waiting cars, and head back to the parties in the mess. For tonight was Christmas Eve in the year of grace 1957, and I was a young pilot trying to get home for his Christmas leave. I was in a hurry, and my watch said 10:15 by the dim glow of the control panel. The heating was turned up full inside the cockpit to prevent the perspex icing up, and it was warm and snug and safe, like a cocoon shielding me from the bitter cold outside, from the freezing night that can kill a man inside a minute if he's exposed to it at 600 miles an hour. Charlie Delta. The controller's voice woke me from my reverie, sounding in my headphones as if he was shouting in my ear. He's had a jar or two already, I thought. Strictly against orders, but what the hell? It's Christmas. Charlie Delta Control, I responded. Charlie Delta, clear takeoff, he said. I saw no point in responding. I simply eased the throttle forward slowly with the left hand, holding the Vampire steady down the central line. Behind me, the low whine of the engine rose and rose, and the snub-nosed fighter rolled forward, the lights each side of the runway passing in ever quicker succession till they were flashing in a continuous blur. At the end of the runway, I pulled the Vampire into a gentle climbing turn to the left, easing up the undercarriage lever as I did so. I heard the clunk of the main wheels entering their bays, the lunge forward of the jet as the drag of the undercarriage vanished. In front of me, the three red lights representing the three wheels extinguished themselves. I held her into the climbing turn, pressing the radio button with the left thumb. Charlie Delta, clear airfield, wheels up and locked, I said into my oxygen mask. Charlie Delta, Roger, over to Channel D, said the controller, and then, Happy Christmas. Strictly against the rules of radio procedure, of course, but I replied, Thank you, Tower, and same to you. Then I switched channels to tune in to Channel D, the RAF's North Germany air control frequency. Down on my right thigh was strapped the map with my course charted on it, but I didn't need it. I knew the details by heart. 66 minutes flying time with the descent and landing, and the Vampire had enough fuel for over 80 minutes. Swinging over Celle airfield at 5,000 feet, I straightened up and watched the needle on my electric compass settle down on a course of 265 degrees. Below, the map of North Germany was growing smaller. It was good to be going home. From Lakenheath, I knew I could get a lift down to London. From London, I was confident I could hitch a lift to my parents' home in Kent. By breakfast time, I'd be celebrating with my family. The altimeter said 27,000 feet. I reduced the throttle setting to give me an airspeed of 485 knots and held her steady on 265 degrees. Somewhere beneath me, the Dutch border would be slipping away, and I'd been airborne for 21 minutes. No problem. The problem started 10 minutes out over the North Sea. But it was several minutes before I became aware that the low hum coming through my headphones had ceased, to be replaced by total silence. The first thing I knew was when I flicked a glance downwards to check my course on the compass. Instead of being rock steady on 265 degrees, the needle was drifting all round the clock. Compass failure at night was no fun. Still, it wasn't too serious. I could call up Lakenheath in a few minutes, and they would give me a GCA, ground-controlled approach, the second-by-second instructions that a well-equipped airfield can give a pilot to bring him home in the worst of weathers. I glanced at my watch, 34 minutes airborne. I could try to raise them now, at the outside limit of my radio range. But first, it'd be correct procedure to inform Channel D, to whom I was tuned, of my little problem, so they could advise Lakenheath I was on my way without a compass. I pressed the transmit button and called, Celle Charlie Delta, calling North Havilland Control. I stopped. There was no point in going on. All I heard was a muffled murmur inside my oxygen mask, my own voice speaking and going nowhere. I tried again. Same result. Far back across the black and bitter North Sea, in the warm, cheery complex of North Havilland Control, men sat back from their control panel, sipping their steaming coffee. And they couldn't hear me. The radio was dead. Fighting down the sense of panic that can kill a pilot faster than anything else, I slowly counted to 10. Then I switched to Channel F and tried to raise Lakenheath ahead of me amid the Suffolk countryside south of Thetford. On Channel F, the radio was as dead as ever. It's a very lonely place, the sky, on a winter's night, and a single-seater jet fighter is a lonely home. But the loneliness is cancelled out by the knowledge that at the touch of a button, the transmit button, the pilot can talk to other human beings. Scores of men and women in control towers across the land that are tuned to his channel can hear him call for help and can locate his position to a few hundred yards. He isn't lost anymore. People can begin working to bring him down. The radar operators call him up and give him instructions. Begin your descent now, Charlie Delta. Warm, experienced voices of people who control an array of electronic devices that can reach out across the winter sky and bring the lost one down to the flare-lit runway that means home and life itself. But for that, the pilot must have a radio, and I knew my 10-channel radio set was as dead as the dodo. It had taken the RAF 2 years to train me to fly their fighters, and most of that time had been training precisely in emergency procedures. How to fly through an emergency and stay alive. Now, the training was beginning to take effect. While I was vainly testing my radio channels, my eyes scanned the instrument panel. The instruments told their own message. It was no coincidence that compass and radio had failed together. Both worked off the aircraft's electrical circuits. Somewhere beneath my feet, there had been a main fuse blowout. The first thing to do in such a case, I remembered, is to reduce throttle setting from cruise speed to a slower setting, from 10,000 revolutions per minute to 7,200, to give maximum flight endurance. I eased the throttle back, but had to judge by its note when the Goblin engine was turning over at about 7,200, and then felt the aircraft slow down. The main instruments in front of a pilot's eyes are 6, including the compass, and all except 2 are electrically operated. That left me with 2 pressure-operated instruments, the airspeed indicator and the altimeter. In other words, I knew how fast I was going and how high I was. It's perfectly possible to land an aircraft with only these 2 instruments, judging the rest by those old navigational aids, the human eyes. Possible, that is, by daylight and with no cloud in the sky. By night, it is not possible. The only things that show up at night are the lights. These have patterns when seen from the sky. If I could identify the great curving bulge of the Norfolk coastline, I could find Norwich, where I knew that there was the only major sprawl of lights set 20 miles inland from all points on the coast. 5 miles north of Norwich was the fighter airfield of Merriam St. George, whose red indicator beacon would be blipping out its Morse identification signal. There, if they only had the sense to switch on the airfield lights when they heard me screaming at low level up and down the airfield, I could land safely. I began to let the Vampire down slowly towards the oncoming coast, the sense of loneliness gripping me tighter and tighter. Below me lay the heavy brutality of the North Sea, waiting to swallow up me and my plane and bury us for endless eternity. And no one would ever know. At 15,000 feet and still diving, I realized that a fresh, and for me the last, enemy had entered the field. There was no ink-black sea 3 miles below me, no twinkling seaside lights somewhere up ahead. Enough to blot out all vision, enough to kill me, the East Anglian fog had moved in. How far westward it stretched I couldn't tell, but there was no question of trying to overfly it. Without navigational aids or radio, I'd be lost over unfamiliar country. Also out of the question was to try and fly back to Holland. I hadn't the fuel. Relying on only my eyes to guide me, it was a question of landing at Merriam St. George or dying amid the wreckage of the Vampire somewhere in the fens of Norfolk. At 10,000 feet, I pulled out of my dive, increasing power slightly to keep myself airborne. using up more of my precious fuel. Still a creature of my training, I recalled the instructions of old Flight Sergeant Norris. When we are totally lost above unbroken cloud, gentlemen, we must consider the necessity of bailing out of our aircraft, must we not? Our first move, therefore, is to turn our aircraft towards the open sea, away from all areas of intense human habitation. The procedures were all worked out. They did not mention that the chances of a pilot bobbing about in a winter's night in the North Sea, supported by a yellow life jacket, ice encrusting on his lips, eyebrows, ears, his position unknown by the men in warm rooms 300 miles away, they did not mention that his chances were less than 1 in 100 of living longer than 1 hour. One last procedure, gentlemen, to be used in extreme emergency. That's better, Sergeant Norris. That's what I'm in now. All aircraft approaching Britain's coasts are visible on the radar scanners of our early warning system. Therefore, we try to attract their attention. We do this by moving out to sea, then flying in small triangles, turning left, left, and left again, each leg of the triangle being of a duration of 2 minutes flying time. When we have been spotted, the aircraft controller diverts another aircraft to find us. When discovered by the rescue aircraft, we formate on him, and he brings us down to a safe landing. Yes, it was the last attempt to save one's life. And I remembered that the rescue aircraft who would lead you back to a safe landing was called the Shepherd. I glanced at my watch. 51 minutes airborne. 30 minutes left of fuel. Knowing myself to be still short of the Norfolk coast, I pulled the Vampire into a left-hand turn and began my first leg of the first triangle. After 2 minutes, I pulled left again. Below me, the fog reached back as far as I could see, and ahead of me also towards Norfolk. It was the same. 10 minutes went by, nearly 2 complete triangles. I had not prayed, not really prayed, for many years, and the habit came hard. Please, God, make somebody notice me up here. Please make someone see me flying in triangles and send up a Shepherd to help me down to a safe landing. Please, please help me. And I promise... What on earth could I promise him? He had no need of me. And I, who now had need of him, had taken no notice of him for so long, he'd probably forgotten all about me. By 72 minutes airborne on my watch, I knew no one would come. I was a young fighter pilot flying my single-seater Vampire. Aspects, I could see the moon was setting. In another 2 minutes, the sky would be plunged into total darkness. And a few minutes later, I would have to bail out of a dying aircraft before its last dive into the water. A bright yellow Mae West jacket supporting a stiff, frozen body. I dropped the left wing of the Vampire towards the moon for the final leg of the last of the set of triangles which I'd been flying, in the hope that I'd be spotted by the radar scanners of the early warning system. Then, down below the wingtip, a black shadow crossed the whiteness. It was another aircraft, low against the fog bank, keeping station with me through my turn. I kept turning, wing down, to keep it in sight. It also kept turning, until the two of us had done one complete circle. Only then did I realize why he didn't climb to my height and take up station on my wingtip. He was flying slower than I. He couldn't keep up if he tried to fly beside me. I eased my throttle back and began to slip down towards him. He kept turning. So did I. At 5,000 feet, I knew I was still going too fast for him. To slow up even more, I put out the air brakes, slowing the Vampire down to 280 knots. And then he came up towards me, 100 feet off my left-hand wingtip. We straightened out together, and I could just make out the shimmer of 2 propellers whirling through the sky ahead of him. Of course he couldn't fly at my speed. I was in a jet fighter. He, in a piston-engined aircraft of an earlier generation. He held station alongside me for a few seconds, then banked gently to the left. I followed, for he was obviously the Shepherd sent up to bring me down, and he had the compass and the radio, not I. He swung through 180 degrees, then straightened up, flying straight and level, the moon behind him. From the position of the dying moon, I knew we were heading back towards the Norfolk coast, and for the first time, I could see him well. To my surprise, the Shepherd was a de Havilland Mosquito, a fighter bomber of Second World War vintage. And then I remembered that the meteorological squadron at Gloucester used mosquitoes to take samples of the upper atmosphere for help in preparing weather forecasts. Inside the cockpit of the Mosquito, I could make out the muffled head of its pilot as he looked out of the side window towards me. Carefully, he raised his right hand, fingers straight, palm downwards. He jabbed the fingers forward and down, meaning, "We are going to descend, formate on me." I nodded and quickly brought up my own left hand so he could see it, pointing forwards to my own control panel with one forefinger, then holding up my 5 splayed fingers. Finally, I drew my hand across my throat. By common agreement, this sign means I have only 5 minutes fuel left, then my engine cuts out. I saw his head nod in understanding. Then we were heading downwards, diving straight towards the shrouded land of Norfolk. He pulled out at 300 feet. The fog was still below us, more than enough to prevent a plane from landing without a GCA. I could imagine the stream of instructions coming from the radar hut into the earphones of the man flying beside me, 80 feet away. I kept my eyes on him, formating as closely as possible, afraid of losing sight of him for an instant, watching for his every hand signal. 2 minutes later, he held up his clenched left fist in the window, then opened the fist, to display all 5 fingers against the glass. "Please lower your undercarriage." I moved the lever downwards and felt the dull thunk as all the 3 wheels went down. The pilot of the Shepherd aircraft pointed down again for another descent. And in the moonlight, I saw that the nose of the Mosquito had the letters JK painted on it, probably for call sign Juliet Kilo. Then we were descending again, more gently this time. The visibility was down to near zero, no shape, no size, no substance, except that dimly off my left wingtip was the form of a Mosquito flying with absolute certainty towards something I could not see. Only then did I realize he was flying without lights. For a second I was horrified by my discovery. And then I realized the wisdom of the man. Lights in fog are treacherous. You can get attracted to them, not knowing whether they're 40 or 100 feet away from you. Keeping formation with him, I knew he was slowing down, for I too was dropping and slowing. I flashed a glance at the altimeter. It was reading 0, so was the fuel gauge, and neither was even flickering. Without warning, the Shepherd pointed a single forefinger at me, then forward through the windscreen. It meant, "There you are, fly on and land." I stared forward through the now streaming windscreen. Nothing. Then, yes, something. Ringed with haze, there were lights either side of me in pairs flashing past. I forced my eyes to see what lay between them. Nothing, blackness. Then a streak of paint running under my feet, the center line. Frantically, I closed down the power and held the Vampire steady. The lights were rising now, almost at eye level. Bang! We touched the deck. Bang, bang. Another touch. She was drifting again, inches above the wet black runway. Then a steady rumble of the wheels. She was down. She stopped. I forget how many seconds I held both my hands clenched round the control column, squeezing the brake lever inwards before I would believe we were stopped. Finally, I did believe it, put on the parking brake, and released the main brake. Then I went to turn off the engine, but there was no need. It had finally run out of fuel. I shut off the remaining systems and slowly began to unstrap myself from the seat. As I did so, a movement caught my eye. To my left, through the fog, low near the ground with wheels up, the Mosquito roared past me. I caught the flash of the pilot's hand in the side window, and then he was gone, up into the fog, before he could see my answering wave of acknowledgement. But I'd already decided to call up RAF Gloucester from the officers' mess and thank him personally. I released the canopy and pushed it upwards and backwards until it locked. Only then, as I stood up, did I realize how freezing cold it was. Nothing happened. At least, not for 10 minutes. Then 2 headlights came groping out of the mist, and I stepped out of the cockpit, jumped from the wing to the ground, and ran towards what turned out to be the headlamps of a battered old charred javelin. At the wheel was a puffed, beery face and a handlebar moustache. At least he wore an RAF officer's cap. He stared at me as I loomed out of the fog. That's yours? He nodded towards the dim shape of the Vampire. Yes, I said. I just landed it. Extraordinary, he said. Quite extraordinary. You better jump in. I'll run you back to the mess. As we moved away from the Vampire, I saw that I'd stopped 20 feet short of a ploughed field at the very end of the runway. You were damn lucky, he shouted. The engine was roaring in first gear, and he seemed to be having trouble with the foot controls. Judging by the smell of whiskey on his breath, that wasn't surprising. Not damned lucky, I agreed. I ran out of fuel just as I was landing. My radio and all the electrical systems failed nearly 50 minutes ago over the North Sea. He spent several minutes digesting the information carefully. Then how did you find this place? He asked. I was guided in, I explained. I flew short left-hand triangles as per instructions, and they sent up a Shepherd aircraft, one of the weather aircraft from RAF Gloucester, to guide me down. Obviously he had radio, so we came in here in formation on a GCA. And then when I saw the lights at the threshold of the runway, I landed myself. Extraordinary, he said. We don't have GCA. We don't have any navigational equipment at all, not even a beacon. Now it was my turn to let the information sink in. This isn't RAF Miriam St. George? I asked. He shook his head. No, he said. This is RAF Minton. I never heard of it, I said at last. Well, I'm not surprised. We're not an operational station, haven't been for years. Minton's a storage depot. Excuse me. He stopped the car and got out. I saw we were standing a few feet from the dim shape of the control tower, adjoining a row of Nissen huts, evidently once navigational and briefing huts. Above the narrow door at the base of the tower through which the officer had disappeared hung a single naked bulb. By its light I could make out broken windows, padlocked doors, an air of abandonment and neglect. The man returned and climbed shakily back behind the wheel. I was just turning the runway lights off, he said. My mind was whirling. This was mad, crazy, illogical. Yet there had to be a perfectly reasonable explanation. Why did you switch them on? I asked. It was the sound of your engine. I was in the officer's mess having a noggin. And old Joe suggested I listen out of the window for a second. And there you were, right above us, sounding as if you were going to come down in a hurry. I thought I might be of some use. Remembered the old runway lights had never been disconnected, so I ran down to the control tower and switched them on. I see. I didn't. But there had to be an explanation. That was why I was so late coming to pick you up, he went on. Had to go back to the mess to get the car out once I'd heard you land out there, and then I had to find you. The mystery puzzled me for another few minutes. And then I hit on the explanation. Where is RAF Minton exactly? I asked him. 5 miles in from the coast, inland from Cromer. That's where we are. And where's the nearest operational RAF station with all the radio aids, including GCA? He thought for a minute. Well, it must be Miriam St. George. They must have all those things. Mind you, I'm just stores, Johnny. That was the explanation. My unknown friend in the weather plane had been taking me straight from the coast to Miriam St. George. By chance, abandoned old stores depot Minton lay right along the in-flight path to Miriam's runway. Miriam's controller had asked us to circle twice while he switched on his runway lights 10 miles ahead, and this old fool had switched on his runway lights as well. Result, coming in on the last 10-mile stretch, I'd plonked my Vampire down on the wrong airfield. I was about to tell him not to interfere with modern procedures that he couldn't understand when I choked the words back. My fuel had run out halfway down the runway. I'd never have made Miriam 10 miles away. By an amazing fluke, I had been, as he said, damned lucky. By the time I'd worked out the rational explanation for my presence at this nearly abandoned airfield, we'd reached the officers' mess. My host parked his car in front of the door, and we climbed out. Above the entrance hall, a light was burning, dispelling the fog and illuminating the carved but chipped crest of the Royal Air Force above the doorway. To one side was a board screwed to the wall. It said, RAF Station Minton. To the other side was another board announcing Officers' Mess. We walked inside. The reader... The place reeked of the expression, it had seen better days. It had indeed. My host, who told me he was Flight Lieutenant Marks, shrugged off his sheepskin coat and threw it over a chair. He was wearing his uniform trousers, but with a chunky blue pullover for a jacket. Must be miserable to spend your Christmas on duty in a dump like this. He told me he was the second in command, the CO now being on Christmas leave. There was no fire in the vestibule, though there was a large brick fireplace, nor any in the bar either. Both rooms were freezing cold, and I was beginning to shiver again after recovering in the car. Marks was putting his head through the various doors leading off the hall, shouting for someone called Joe.
I'm sorry it's not very hospitable, old boy,
said Marks, having failed to find the absent Joe.
Being only 2 officers on station here and no visitors to speak of, we've each made 2 bedrooms into a sort of self-contained apartment where we live. You can't heat all this space in winter, you know, not all the fuel they allow us.
Not to worry, I said, dropping my flying helmet and attached oxygen mask into a chair. Though I could do with a bath and a meal.
Oh, I think we can manage that,
he said, trying hard to play the genial host.
I'll get Joe to fix up one of the spare rooms and heat up the water. He'll also rustle up a meal. Not much, I'm afraid. Bacon and eggs do.
Oh, it'll do fine. While I'm waiting, do you mind if I use your phone?
Certainly, certainly.
He ushered me into the secretary's office, small and cold, but it had a chair and a telephone. While I was waiting for the operator, Marks returned with a tumbler of whiskey, and then he went off to supervise the steward. My watch told me it was close to midnight. Hell of a way to spend Christmas, I thought. And then I recalled how 30 minutes earlier I'd been crying to God for a bit of help and felt ashamed. "Little Minton," said a drowsy voice. It took ages to get through to the operational RAF station at Merriam St. George, but eventually the phone was ringing. "RAF Merriam St. George," said a man's voice. "Duty controller, air traffic control, please," I said, and gave him my name and rank. "Speaking from RAF Minton," I told him. "Oh, I see, sir. But I'm afraid there's no flying tonight, sir. There's no one on duty in air traffic control." "Then give me the station duty officer, please." When I got through to him, I explained about the emergency and the fact that his station had been alerted to receive a vampire fighter coming in without radio. I'm not on air traffic," he said. "But I don't think we've been operational since we closed down at 5 o'clock this afternoon. Do you hold on? I'll get the wing commander." There was a pause, and then an older voice came on the line. I explained the matter again. "So you see, sir, I was intercepted by the weather plane from Gloucester, and he brought me in. But in this fog, it must have been on a GCA. When I saw the lights of Minton, I landed here, assuming it to be Merriam St. George."
Splendid," he said at length.
"Marvellous bit of flying by that pilot from Gloucester. What do you want us to do about it?" I was getting exasperated. "I'm ringing to alert you to stand down your radar and traffic control crews, sir. They must be waiting for a vampire that's never going to arrive. It's already arrived, here at Minton."
"But we're closed down," he said. "We shut all the systems down at 5 o'clock. There's been no call for us to turn out."
I asked the next and last question slowly and carefully. "Do you know, sir, where is the nearest RAF station to here that maintains 24-hour emergency listening.
Yes, he said. To the west, RAF Marham. To the south, RAF Lakenheath. Good night, Jill. Happy Christmas.
He put the phone down. I sat back and breathed deeply. On the fuel I was carrying, not only could I not have made Miriam St. George, it wasn't even open. So how could I life to the weather pilot, but to beery old Flight Lieutenant Marks, who couldn't tell one end of an aircraft from another, but who had run 400 yards through the fog to switch on the lights of an abandoned runway because he heard a jet engine circling overhead too close to the ground. Still, the Mosquito must be back at Gloucester by now, and I thought he should know that despite everything, I was alive. One thing about weather squadrons, they're always on duty. I explained the position to the duty officer who took the call.
Well, I'm afraid there must be some mistake, flying officer, he said.
It could not have been one of ours. We used to use Mosquitoes, but they went out of service 3 months ago. I sat holding the telephone, staring at it in disbelief. Then an idea came to me. What happened to them? I asked. Could one of them have been sold privately?
I suppose it's possible, he said. But I think they went to aircraft museums.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And happy Christmas. I put the phone down and shook my head in bewilderment. What an incredible night. First I lose my radio and all my instruments. Then I get lost and short of fuel. Then I'm taken in tow by some harebrain flying his own Mosquito through the night who happens to spot me, comes within an inch of killing me. And finally, a half-drunk ground duty officer has the sense to put his runway lights on in time to save me. Flight Lieutenant Marks put his head round the door.
Your room's ready,
he said.
Number 17, just down the corridor. Joe's making up the fire for you now. The bath water's heating. If you don't mind, I think I'll turn in. You'll be all right on your own.
Sure, I'll be fine. Many thanks for all your help. I took my helmet and wandered down the corridor. As I entered the door of 17, an old man rose from his knees in front of the fireplace. He was near 70, a civilian employee.
Oh, good evening, sir, he said. I'm Joe, sir. I'm the mess steward.
Yes, Joe, Mr. Marks told me about you. I'm sorry to cause you so much trouble at this hour of the night. I just dropped in, as you might say.
Yeah, Mr. Marks told me. I'll have your room ready directly. As soon as this fire burns up, it'll be quite cosy.
While Joe went to fetch my lonely meal, I had a quick bath, for the water was by now reasonably hot. While I toweled myself and wrapped round me an old but warm dressing gown that Joe had brought with him, he set out a small table and placed a plate of sizzling bacon and eggs on it. By now, the room was comfortably warm, the coal fire burning brightly. While I ate, the old steward stayed to talk. You been here long, Joe? I asked him.
Oh, yes, sir. Since just before the war when the station opened.
Ah, you've seen some changes, eh? Wasn't always like this.
Oh, that it wasn't, sir.
And he told me of the days when the rooms were crammed with eager young pilots, and when the sky above the airfield crackled and snarled to the sound of engines driving planes to war and bringing them back again. While he talked, I finished my meal, and then rose and sauntered round the room. The steward began to clear the table. I halted before an old photograph in a frame, standing alone on the mantelshelf. I stopped, feeling the room go suddenly cold. The photo was old, but clear enough. It showed a young man in his early 20s, dressed in flying gear, but not that of today. He wore thick sheepskin-lined boots, rough serge trousers, and a heavy sheepskin zip-up jacket. From his left hand dangled one of the soft leather flying helmets they used to wear, with goggles attached. He stared at the camera with grim intentness. There was something sad about the eyes. Behind him, quite clearly visible, stood his aircraft. There was no mistaking the lean, sleek silhouette of the Mosquito fighter bomber. Who's the pilot, Joe?
I nodded towards the lonely photograph on the mantel shelf. Oh, that's a photo of Mr. Kavanagh, sir. He was an Irish gentleman. A very fine man, if I may say so. As a matter of fact, sir, this was his room. What squadron was that, Joe? I was still peering at the aircraft in the background. Pathfinders, sir. Mosquitoes they flew. Remarkable pilots, all of them, sir. But I venture to say I believe Mr. Johnny was the best of them all. But then I'm biased, sir. I was his batman, you see. There was no doubting it. The faint letters on the nose of the Mosquito behind the figure in the photo read J.K. Not Juliet Kilo, but Johnny Kavanagh. Ah, and the whole thing was as clear as day. Kavanagh had been a superb pilot, flying with one of the crack squadrons during the war. After the war, he'd left the Air Force, probably going into second-hand car dealing, as quite a few did. So he'd made a pile of money in the booming 50s, probably bought an old Mosquito in one of the RAF periodic auctions of obsolescent aircraft, refitted it, and flew it privately whenever he wished. So he'd been flying back from some trip to Europe, spotted me turning in triangles above the cloud bank, realized I was stuck, and taken me in tow. Pinpointing his position precisely by cross radio beacons, and knowing this stretch of the coast by heart, he'd taken a chance of finding his old airfield at Minton, even in thick fog. It was a hell of a risk, but then I had no fuel left anyway, so it was that or bust. He certainly was a good pilot, I said reflectively, thinking of this evening's performance. Oh, the best, sir, said old Joe from behind me. They reckon he had eyes like a cat, did Mr. Johnny. I remember many's the time the squadron would return from dropping flares over bombing targets in Germany, and the rest of the young gentlemen would go into the bar and have a drink, more likely several. But often he'd have his Mosquito refueled and take off again alone for a second flight to see if he could find some crippled bomber making for the coast and guide 'em home back here to Minton. I could imagine them in my mind's eye, a wounded or dying crew and the radio shot to bits. And I knew from too recent experience the bitter loneliness of the winter sky at night with no radio, no guide for home, and the fog blotting out the land. And he used to guide them back, you say? That's right, sir. Sometimes through fog so dense you couldn't see your hand. 6th sense, they said he had. I nodded. Well, I said, by the look of it, he's still doing it. Now Joe smiled. Oh, I hardly think so, sir. Mr. Johnny went out on his last patrol Christmas Eve, 1943. 14 years ago tonight, sir. He never come back. He went down with his plane somewhere in the North Sea. Oh. Well, good night, sir. And happy Christmas.
Tony Britton has been reading the third